Welcome to the Holmlands Adventure Podcast. Storytelling inspired by adventure.
Hello and welcome to the Holmlands Adventure Podcast. Today, it's a pleasure to be joined by author, writer and adventurer, Laura Kennington. Hi, Laura.
Thanks for having me. Hi, Cameron.
It's a pleasure to have you on. So I've just finished reading your book, Kairos, your first book, which was published last year. So I wanted to start off with that and just ask you, what does Kairos mean for those of people that don't know, and why did you choose that as the title of your book?
So Kairos is an ancient Greek word, and it's a different sort of time. So the ancient Greeks had two different words for time. One of them is chronos, which is probably quite familiar to everyone. It's this chronological time that we are all kind of very aware of. And then there's Kairos time, which is a little harder to pin down, but it's basically loosely defined as the opportune moment, the moment that everything kind of clicks into place and serendipity and all of that. You know, I think we've all experienced these things that just line up really well. So I came across that word a few years ago and I absolutely just loved it. At the time I was working a job I hated, and it was always like, oh, I'll do something cool one day, and oh, I'll just save up a bit of money and then I'll have a life that, you know, doesn't drive me completely nuts. And I slowly but surely realized that actually you can waste a whole lifetime just waiting for this perfect moment to just fall into your lap. And I don't think that's actually how life works. So I chose Kairos because it kind of underpinned every decision that I took a few years ago to sort of branch out and have a bit more adventure in my life, because I realized that I wasn't going to find that moment. I had to go out and grab it and make stuff happen. So Kairos for me is this concept that's really central to kind of every big decision that I make, and every little decision too, I guess.
Which is a brilliant philosophy and mentality to have, and a great name for the book. When you're in that job that you hate, when was the moment that it came into your mind, okay, I have to quit? Was it a big build up over a long time, or was it almost that Jerry Maguire moment of walking into the office and taking the goldfish and saying, okay,
I wish I'd done it like that. I really wish I'd made a more dramatic exit. It was a bit of both. Like, I was really unhappy. There was kind of this niggling unhappiness for a little while. It was in my 20s, and I'd kind of looked around. Everyone was being really responsible. They were saving up for mortgages, and I'd slowly but surely kind of succumbed to this pressure. And so found myself in this job, realized almost immediately, like, something didn't feel good. Like, this didn't feel like a good decision, but I went along with it for a while. And then the real turning point for me is where I start the book out with, actually. So I took myself to Yosemite National Park with all my corporate wages, treated myself to this really outrageous holiday, a couple of weeks in San Francisco. And this tour guide, we were going around Yosemite. We'd been doing some small jumps into like all these natural lakes, and I was feeling really cool. And then I think he must have been joking. We've argued about this since, but he pointed out this massive cliff in the distance to the group and kind of said, oh, we should jump off that next. And I don't know, it must have been the extra oxygen, or that the tour guide was really cute, but I just blurted out like, yeah, let's do it. And I was the only one silly enough to kind of go along with such enthusiasm. Neither of us wanted to back down. So long story short, the tour guide and I find ourselves on top of this 40-foot cliff, getting ready to jump off into this freezing cold glacial lake underneath it. And you know, he at some point confesses that he's got no idea how safe it is. I go very quickly from feeling like a badass to feeling like a complete moron, and like I'm running through all these list of injuries and all the things that go wrong. And then I realize that I'm still happier with this risk assessment of potentially breaking all of my bones and, you know, potentially having this fatal accident than I am about going back into the office next week. And I just thought, there's got to be, you know, I think that was the real turning point for me. I was like, I would rather go off the cliff into oblivion and that be the way that I go, or like that be the story, rather than like 5, 10, 20, 30 years in this office not having anything to talk about. And I just thought, this is not right. You know, you shouldn't be this unhappy that you're willing to just go off a cliff and you know, potentially risk your life and limb just to have a bit of excitement.
why did adventure become your outlet? Can you link it back to that moment as being on holiday, or was it something that was in your mind already to be, you know, I think you know, in terms of wanting more out of life, that you could change job, you could, you know, take up new hobbies, but why was it adventure?
I didn't jump straight into adventure when I came back. I realized that I liked being active. I grew up on a farm, so actually my childhood was really active. I was always outdoors exploring, and I felt like I'd completely disconnected from that when I was living in London. And that trip really reminded me of that aspect of things that I loved, you know, just being outside, going hiking, all of those things. And so the first thing I did actually was get qualified as a personal trainer, because I thought, oh, well, that's what I need. You know, this will be my new career. I just really love being active. I can support people, I can get them to be active, and it'll just be such a nicer way to spend Monday to Friday. And actually that didn't turn out to be the case. I didn't enjoy being a personal trainer. I quite enjoyed the classes, and I still quite enjoy doing like group events, but it still wasn't quite the right fit. But what it did do was give me this insight into sports science, and I think it was just one of those happy accidents that it kind of spiraled from there. So with this newfound knowledge of how the body works, I was like, oh, I wonder if I can do this. And it's really just, that's been it for the past 5 years. It's this, I wonder if I can do this. And then the more that I've done, the more I've been like, oh, okay, I've done that. I wonder if my body can do this. And it just completely flipped my concept of what the body could do, because I just thought I wasn't very sporty naturally. And I realized that's complete nonsense, because the body just adapts to what you put it through, really.
The book's really enjoyable and a really great read, but I don't think I've ever read a book where I've actually felt angry. And the reason I say that is because one of the first big challenges, or maybe the first big challenge that you did, was you decided to head off and take on a river in Russia, but it didn't quite go to plan. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about that story and how the negativity that came from something that should have been so positive affected you.
Yeah, so Russia is this ridiculous story. So the idea was to kayak the Volga River in Russia, 2,300 miles long. I'd be away for a couple of months, and it's going to be the biggest thing I'd ever done. So I spent months planning for it, prepping for it. And then, you know, adventure, I guess, is the stuff you can't plan for. So I had this risk assessment of all the things I needed to know, like where the dams were, all of this sort of stuff. And it was just this Molotov cocktail where the trip became really popular very, very quickly. So I stayed with this lovely couple in Moscow for the first couple of days on this website called Couchsurfing. And they helped me get like a Russian SIM card. And then I explained to them a bit more about what I was doing. And they were like, oh, great. You know, maybe if we put a post up on this social media site, which is basically the Russian version of Facebook, like it's vk.com, saying this guy is staying with us. If you can help her out along the way, I'm sure she'd be really grateful for like a bed or a shower along the way. And that post just went bananas. And I still really don't understand how that sort of stuff happens. You know, I thought cat videos were the main thing to go viral, but it did go completely viral in 24 hours. Like I woke up the next morning to have like 5,000 messages. My Facebook page again had like boomed overnight to like, I think I had maybe 400 on there. And that again went up to like 5,000-6,000. And it just kept building momentum from that initial kind of eruption of popularity. So at the start of the river, I had a couple of news crews there translating my interviews into like 5 or 6 different languages. And that attention didn't ever really go away. So I only lasted on that trip, I think, a couple of weeks before it just became really apparent that it wasn't safe to continue under this incredible publicity and scrutiny, I guess. So yeah, it was a very, very bizarre few weeks.
And so at the time, if you can take yourself back to that moment when you're seeing all these notifications coming through, are you thinking at that moment that, oh, this is great? Because presumably, you know, you're working with different partners and sponsors that help you with kit, and, you know, it's getting you. Are you thinking, oh, wow, well, the spotlight's going to be even more on them than maybe it would have been initially?
Yeah, I was fundraising for a charity as well. So I was like, oh my God, this is so exciting. You know, I thought it was this huge positive thing because I was super nervous to begin with as well. Obviously, it's like the biggest thing I'd ever undertaken. And, you know, it just felt like this warm embrace to Russia. I was like, wow, this is so great. Here I was all nervous about going off and I'm getting this incredible welcome. And like, this will be so good for the charity. I can over deliver on all my sponsorships. And I did think I thought it was positive for the majority of the time, actually. Like I was very much trying to view it under this positive umbrella. And it was only slowly but surely when I began to realize that actually the flip side of that, you know, was very real and couldn't be ignored either, that I was like, oh, it does have some noticeable downsides too.
At what point did you realize I can't be here anymore? I have to remove myself from this situation. Was there a particular moment where it really became apparent that there's no way to carry on?
Yeah, I mean, the incident that brought it to a head is one that I mentioned in the book. I was camping on the river one night with a father and son. So we'd been kind of overtaking each other throughout the last couple of days. Like I'd seen them, they were kayaking, I was kayaking. And we were just kind of at the same pace on one of these days, and we decided to camp together. And I thought, well, that would be really nice. I haven't, you know, had a conversation with anyone properly for a while. And so we were setting up our camp. And we'd gone to bed after having our dinner by the campfire or whatever. And then I get woken up, I think about 11 o'clock, by just this kind of rabble of voices. And it just, they were all quite drunk. Like I go into it a bit more in the book, but it just basically became very apparent that these people had driven for hours to come and find me. It was quite a tense situation. They were really quite aggressive. They didn't want to leave. The father was really apprehensive because he wasn't translating all of what they were saying, but there was a really nasty undertone to kind of the whole thing. And this poor 8-year-old kid, Vanya, who was with us, you know, the son, just looked absolutely petrified. And I wasn't not scared. It was just deeply uncomfortable. And all I could think that on that instant was I could have been camped by myself and it would have had a totally different outcome. You know, I think there was about 10 of them there, and it was thanks to the father translating and kind of trying to calm the situation down a bit. And I said that, you know, I just thought to myself, that is pure luck that I've just got the one night in this entire trip so far that I'm camped with someone. And that really shook me, actually. I didn't sleep at all that night. You know, I thought, are they going to come back? And I think I managed to calm it down by saying, yeah, I'll come and hang out with you the next night. And I can't wait to see you all for dinner. That sounds great. And it just was a bit too close. And actually the father had been saying to me, you know, you'll be the towns that are busier, you want to be really careful because you're going to have a lot more of this. And obviously I'm largely unaware on my little kayak of what's going on in the media. Like I'm only checking my phone maybe once or twice a day. You know, I'm on my boat for like 12 hours a day. So I'm largely unaware of just how much this storm has kind of continued to grow. So that was the real turning point. I came off the river because I was like, right, I'll have a proper look at it when, you know, with Wi-Fi, to just have a calm assessment of it, not in between kind of paddling sessions. And I just was bowled over by, actually, when I did sit down to look at it, just how huge it had gotten. But that incident was definitely the turning point.
Which is why made me so angry reading your story, because you got to this point in life where you realize you're not where you want to be. You've made that great move, bold move of quitting your job, which I'm sure many people, you know, perhaps listening to this will be thinking, oh, I'm not quite happy in what I'm doing. What do I do next? Where do I go? And you've gotten over that tipping point and put yourself out there into the world to take on this incredible challenge. And then not only having to end the challenge early, and I'm sure we've been very disappointed in that. When you come back to the UK, there's some pretty horrible headlines being written.
I think that was one of the hardest things for me, because my overall experience of Russia was my initial experience of like this incredible warm welcome, and that just got completely buried under controversy. You know, everyone loves like the negative stuff, so everyone's like, oh yeah, these few people did this, and I was like, cool, can we also talk about the family that took me in for 2 weeks? Like, can we just balance it out? But that's not how our press works. It's generally not how most kind of things like that work. You know, everyone loves the scandal, and it was really sad for me when I thought of how much kindness I'd received, that just got buried under, you know, the few. I mean, it was a significant minority, but it was still a minority for sure. So that was the most frustrating thing for me, I think.
I'm sure a lot of disappointment in not being able to fulfill the challenge in the way that you originally intended. Now, several years on, would you ever return to the river to take on the challenge again or complete the route?
Yeah, I do get asked that one quite a lot. I have to say, it's not high on my list at the moment, and the reason for that is that I wouldn't go back until I knew it would be different, and I can't see that I would be able to go back under the radar and that just wouldn't kick up all again, if not worse. After leaving and all the headlines, like I think if I was to go back now, it would probably kick it all up again and probably double the publicity. So yeah, until I think that would be different, I'm not particularly inclined to do it. I don't think it's fair on kind of anyone involved. And also, I just think there are other rivers, like that's not what I went there for. I didn't go there to kind of have all this publicity. I went there to have a couple of months by myself, figure out this new chapter in my life. And that's what I love about adventure, is the simplicity of it. So maybe one day, but not anytime soon, I don't think.
I think, and one thing that struck me about the way that you perhaps craft your adventures is that there seems to be a very personal stamp on them, and that how important is it for you to take the road that's perhaps less trodden and do something that's a little bit different to the norm within the adventure travel circuit?
I think half of my joy comes from planning the adventures. For me, it is about crafting them all by myself and just looking at the map with a sense of curiosity. So it's why I don't tend to do organised events. Like, I've got nothing against them. I dabbled in them maybe early on, but they just really don't motivate me. Whereas planning it and pulling it all together, it really adds to my sense of enjoyment and really adds to my sense of kind of pride at the end when I finished it. I like to take control over all of it. And yeah, like for me, it's about kind of exploring as well. So the reason I kind of avoid organised events is because I'm like, oh, where do I want to go? And wouldn't it be cool to kind of plan this and plot my own route? So yeah, it's very integral, I think, to every trip that I do, that it's got my stamp on it, I think.
And a lot of the challenges that you take on are solo, and you're in your own headspace a lot of the time. How do you prepare for that mentally?
Really interesting question, because I think there's a few different aspects to it. I tend to flood myself with kind of resources. So I read a lot, and I read a lot of mindset books, and that's kind of always going on in the background anyway, because I find it a fascinating topic. And then I think I need to do this less now because I've got a bit of experience behind it. But in the early days, I just practiced suffering. So like I would set the alarm for 3:00 in the morning, and obviously no one really wants to get out of bed at 3:00 in the morning in winter. But that was a really good muscle to kind of strengthen, because I'm like, well, if you're going to have to do something that sucks on your trip, then at least you'll kind of get used to just this idea of doing things that you don't want to do. And so I'd practice things like that, and I'd practice long training sessions. And I just think that stubbornness is something that you can cultivate like a muscle. And if you just get used to demanding a bit more of yourself and not using excuses, and yeah, I think that really helps. So all of that kind of has played off in the adventures. When I'm having a really tough day, I'm like, cool, I know what this is. I know I am miserable and I just have to carry on, which is like the 3 a.m. alarm or whatever else.
There's another layer to that, though, isn't there? Because if you're in the moment on an adventure, you have to react to that moment because it's happening right there and then. But when you're at home and you're setting an alarm at 3:00 in the morning, you're at home, you're in bed, you're perhaps cozied up, and you think, well, I don't have to.
Yeah.
So that's almost, in certain way, the bigger challenge. So how, when you're in that preparation mentality, do you stick to those little mini kind of challenges and suffering tasks that you set yourself?
I think I lie to myself. So I sort of say, oh, you can just do 10 minutes. And that for me is like the key for most training sessions that I don't want to do, or most things that I find really difficult. Even if it's like sitting down to do some admin or whatever, I'm like, cool, just start it, take that first step. And if you're still not feeling it after like 10 to 20 minutes, you can just bail on it and come back. But I find, for me anyway, if I'm out on the road for the first 10 minutes, I'm not going to come back. I've already got out the door, and I think it is that initial thing that is so tough. So for me, I just give myself this pretend excuse that I'm like, well, you can come back after 10 minutes if you want. And that is not true. I know I'm probably not going to come back, but knowing that that is my option sometimes helps.
And something else that I picked up on, which I think's been asked before, but you don't have a TV, and for a lot of people, that's it's a comfort to spend time watching TV and watching films and binging series and whatnot. But do you think that actually having perhaps less time away from the screen in your normal day-to-day life when you're not on the road having an adventure helps with that mental preparedness for when you are in the challenge?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I haven't had a TV for years now, and I have to say, I think it's one of the best life decisions I have ever done. I still, if I really feel the need to have a really bit of like lazy chill out, I've got Amazon, there's Netflix, I can log on to stuff and do it if I want to watch it on my laptop. But for me, the key difference is I'm actively and consciously going there because I want to watch something. And I think the deadly thing about the TV is that you just sit there and you flick and you just kind of, even if there's nothing on, you're sat there, so you do it. Whereas for me, it will be because I actively want to watch a documentary or I want to see a film. Otherwise I'm reading, and it's much less passive, so it's much more directed if I'm going there. And I just think that has freed up an awful lot of time to do a lot more valuable things than kind of sit in front of the screen.
And one of the next big challenges that you took on was to cycle the North Coast 500 route in Scotland, and having been through that experience in Russia and not complete the challenge, you head to Scotland and incur an injury and don't complete that challenge. How was that for you in then taking on not the second big endeavours that didn't quite work out the way that you intended? Did you find that challenging mentally? Was that tough? Did you feel, how do you cope with the disappointment of it, which I imagine must have been there?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I feel like ever since that Russian mishap, I'd had this little chip on my shoulder about I can't ever fail anything again. Like that whole experience was so painful that I was just determined to never fail again at anything. And then I got confronted with it in Scotland. Like I literally couldn't put any weight on my left leg. And I probably tried to carry on a bit further than I should have done because of this, like, you will not fail. But I have to say that whole experience I'm really grateful for now, because this big fear that I'd been building up in my head about you cannot fail, you have to be perfect, like never again would you go through that, actually turned out to be great, because it was all in my head. I was basically imagining all these headlines again and all of that, and actually none of that happened. What I found is when I failed in Scotland because I'd hurt my leg, I just got this outpouring of compassion and like, oh, don't worry, I'm so sorry, I hope you heal soon. And that really took me by surprise, because I was sat there like braced for all this kind of crap to come back at me, and I was like, oh no, that's obviously not how like people behave. Like, I don't know why I had this horror. I think it was, obviously a hangover from the British tabloids going nuts a few years ago. But it was also a really good reminder to me that I should accept failure, because otherwise, if I'm just living in fear of failing, I'm never going to do anything. And it was really important for me as well to have a bit of kindness. That was the first trip, I think, that brought in like a bit more compassion, because I'd lost my nan a couple of weeks before, and so I shouldn't have really been in the Highlands to begin with. I think it was the week before I'd flown home from the funeral and then got on the sleeper train to Scotland. So this injury and just the general grief that had been hanging over the trip was actually, it's good that it stopped me in my tracks, because it's unsustainable, I think, to constantly, you can get yourself so far with stubbornness and beating yourself over the finish line, but I don't know that that's sustainable for a long period of time. So it was really difficult, but it was definitely a good thing.
At any point did you feel, this is happening again, this isn't for me? Because you talk about the kindness there, but that's in the I suppose in the aftermath of having finished the challenge early. But in the moment, are you thinking, no, this isn't what I should be doing? Or does it make you even more resilient and determined to think, no, this is ending not in the way that I wanted to again, but do you know what, next time it doesn't matter? Or you're creating your own rules.
Yeah, it's interesting actually. At no point in all of that distress, I remember being on the phone to my friend, like crying, being like, I'm going to have to turn back. I can't walk. And like even remember kind of talking it through with her. And actually she was the one that pointed out, like, you should probably just turn back. Because I was like, maybe I can just carry on with my right leg. And she kind of echoed back to me how completely ridiculous that was. But at no point did I think, oh, I've picked the wrong career. Like at no point did I think that. It was more just like, how am I going to live through this again? Like, how am I going to, it felt more like just a step back. And I thought I'd gone past this thing of having to prove past the failure. And I was like, oh, not again. Like, it wasn't that, oh, I should just quit and run away and never be seen. It was like, oh God, do I really have to build myself back up again after another failure?
Something that you continue to do, and as you started off with in Russia, was to use a tracking system so that people can monitor where you are on your journey. Did you get put off by that, and why did you continue to use a tracking system? And I know we spoke just before recording the episode about a mutual friend of ours, Lindsay Cole. When we spoke with her in an earlier episode of the podcast, she circumnavigated Australia and actually had found perhaps some comfort in speaking with the press. But did you ever feel that anonymity might be your friend in terms of, maybe only communicating with a close circle rather than publicly, making it known where you were at any given point in time? And how much pressure maybe did you feel from certain sponsors to be able to, be publicly telling your story as you're going on the journeys?
Yeah, it's interesting actually, because I certainly made some modifications to the tracking system, and it's very much relevant on the situation for the challenge as well. So on a bike, for example, I've done a lot of my trip cycling. It's very easy for me to switch the tracker off early if I'm camping. So I do that for sure, which actually I did in Russia as well. It's just a bit harder to hide on a river because you can only really be on like one side of the bank. But if you're on a bike, for example, I can just, if I know I'm going to be looking for a campsite in a couple of hours, I can just switch the tracker off before I'm going to camp. And I can be relatively confident that no one's going to actually track me down, especially in the Highlands of Scotland or, the wilderness of Ireland and places like that. And the second thing I think as well is that I actually think that the chances of what happened in Russia, it was such a, like I said earlier, like a Molotov cocktail, of this trip becoming hugely public in a way that hasn't ever really happened since. And I don't think it probably would. I think it's very unusual to get that much attention on someone who's doing a trip. So for me, yeah, it's a justifiable risk, or like it's a risk that I calculate depending on the situation. I keep the tracking map because I love connecting with schools and I love being able to share that, and they can match the miles and they can get really involved, and I think that's really positive to be like planting these seeds. In terms of pressure to share, I think that was the last bit of that question, pressure to share the journey live. I don't know that I feel pressure at all from sponsors. For me, again, it's seeing what good can come of it. And I actually really enjoy that storytelling aspect of it. I never do it to the detriment of kind of my own well-being. So if I feel like I need to shut off, I would do that. But I also, as you said earlier, a lot of those trips are solo. So for me, it's actually really nice to have that connection as well. So like on the last trip I did, there were some really tough days, and I would just be like, I'm just going to be honest. I'm just going to write, this Instagram post, whatever, like just updating people on the fact that I've had a really tough day and let the chips fall where they may. And actually that encouragement in lieu of human contact was really nice. I'd wake up and see this and it would give me a little boost. So I think it's a kind of circular process of, sharing the highs and lows with people, which maybe inspires them to think that you don't have to be invincible to do it. And then I get a huge kind of reward from that as well.
There's a lot of will and determination to get to a finishing line, and a lot of the endeavors that you take on are long journeys, running 100 miles across Fuerteventura and cycling 8,000 miles or kilometers.
Kilometers.
Kilometers. It's still a long way, no matter what metric you put to it. But how present do you feel when you're on an adventure? Can you be present in the moment, or is it focused on the finishing line all the time? Are you constantly ahead of yourself to be able to motivate yourself in your mind to, it's getting to the end, or can you enjoy the journey as you go?
I think it kind of is on a scale, to be honest. So depending on what kind of day I'm having, actually on the tougher days, I don't even think about the finish line at all. Like I'm really present on the tough days, because if I think about, like, I think the last one, I think I was in Germany and I still had like maybe just under 2,000 miles ahead of me, and I felt absolutely broken. I was in the worst possible mood, and the thought of 2,000 miles was just almost debilitating. So I brought it right back, and I just kind of like my 10-minute rule at home. I'm like, cool, you don't have to do 2,000 miles. Maybe just get to the next petrol station, and maybe get to the end of today. And if you want to quit by the end, tomorrow morning, then maybe we'll look at it again then. And I think it's because I have this rule that you just don't give up when you're crying, and you don't give up when you're in a bad mood. Like, have a shower, have a night if you need it, and rest and really sleep. And then if doing that, after doing that, you still feel like quitting, then maybe there's something in it. But I think it's really important to recognize that emotions are not always rational. And they pass as well. You can sometimes go through like 17 different emotions during the course of a day on your bike. And it's important to know that logically, as tough as it feels. So for me, actually staying present on a trip is often how I succeed, I think.
We touched on it earlier, that the sort of personal nature, the planning that you put in, the preparation and the enjoyment that you have into the adventures that you create. As a professional adventurer, how much say do you have in your own adventures? Is it all on your own terms, or are you guided by some of the sponsors and partners that perhaps come to you and say, hey Laura, we'd like you to do this, and perhaps feature our product along the way?
I'm very lucky, or I've been very determined either way. But for me, it's definitely the former, not the latter. So I do count myself lucky in that the sponsors that I've got, especially the long-term brand partners, are completely supportive. And it's up to me. Like, I tell them what I'm doing, and they kind of fit in with that, and they support that. I don't think there's ever really been much compromise. I think every brand that I've spoken to has been because I'm doing this, and I think they can fit in with it. And I don't know that I'd feel really that comfortable if it was the other way around. So for me, it's the adventure definitely comes first, and then it's fitting the brands in around it. And luckily, they're all completely fine with that too.
And you do, you mentioned schools, you do a lot of public speaking and talks. What are the questions that you get asked the most? Which questions do you love getting asked?
Sorry, I'm giggling because as soon as you said schools, my favourite question in any school talk is always from like this cheeky little kid in the front row who asks about where I go to the toilet and things like that, because I do a lot of corporate talks as well, and they're always like, cool, so let's talk about budget and let's talk about risk assessment, and it's fine, like that stuff is cool to chat about too, but you can, like, so in schools it's always like these wacky, but where did you go for a poo, and like, all of that, and you just see the teachers looking absolutely horrified, like, you can't ask that, it's not polite. So yeah, I love left field questions like that.
And perhaps what are the questions that you don't like answering? Are there any that get put to you and you think, well, that's maybe overstepping the mark a little bit?
Oh, interesting. I don't know that there's any that I don't like. I think I can't think of, because anything that rubs me up the wrong way a bit, I view it as an opportunity to kind of set people straight. So there's there's not a lot, but occasionally you'll get someone who'll be like, oh, well, I'd love to do that, but I've got this mortgage and this. And it's not really a question. It's just kind of, they just lob it out there. To which my only response is like, cool, with different life choices. Like, I decided not to have a mortgage, so I appreciate that's part of it. But B, also, I'm not saying everyone quit their job. Like, I don't think I've ever said that in any single talk or any interaction that I've ever done, because lots of people shouldn't quit their jobs, and lots of people would hate spending 3 months on their bike. But I do think that you can take stuff back from these big adventures, and you can be like, cool, how can I bring a bit more of that into my own life? So I think what I find frustrating sometimes is when people say, oh, well, I'd love to do that, but I can't because of time, money, commitments, blah, blah, blah. And I get that. Maybe it's not practical to head off on a 3-month trip, but I'm not advocating that people do. So I find it frustrating when that pops up. I'm just like, cool, can you take that and then maybe do something that fits in? Like, look at what you can do rather than the 3-month epic that you can't. But yeah, that's about the only thing I can think of.
And I can imagine that when you're on an adventure and you're undertaking a challenge, there's a lot of drive and determination. Hard work goes into that, physically, mentally, in the preparation stages, but also in the downtimes as well, trying to perhaps bring in partners and sponsors and make a living out of the things that you enjoy doing. Have you ever felt any? Has there ever been any times where you've felt the pull of the 9-to-5 world bringing you back in to almost say, oh, this might not be sustainable in the long term?
Well, recent pandemic aside, no, just kidding. No, I have to say, I don't think so, actually, because even when I'm having these and it's not to say, to be clear about this, it's not to say that I've never had wobbles and thought, oh my God, this isn't sustainable and how do I make this work? Because there's been tons of those. Any self-employed person, I think, will recognize that of, have I made a massive mistake? And, oh, I probably could have had, the house that my friend has now. And you see people who make different choices and the things that they have as a result of that and how easier some things are. But I don't think I've ever felt enough like that to make me reconsider what I'm doing. It's more just like, okay, this is really frustrating. What am I missing? How can I make it better? So it's not like, oh, I've made a mistake and let's quit. It's like, cool, there's obviously something showing up here. But there's a solution, and there's a solution, I think, there that doesn't involve me going back to a job I hate. Like, I think that there's enough options in the world to think creatively, to think, well, maybe I can do this and maybe I can, and still be doing something that I actually care about.
When you're facing a tough moment, you're cycling through Scotland, the weather's horrible and the hills really steep.
Sounds about right, yeah.
Everything's
very
going
on
wrong.
brand for Scotland, yeah.
I've been there and done it, so
yeah,
I know as well. But when you're in those tough moments and those really sort of dark moments, and you're by yourself, again, a large part of the time on these challenges, are there some moments that you then take and reflect back upon from other adventures that you've been on that are your go-to memories, that you think, okay, well, I had this moment at that time and it really helps you to push on and move forward? And perhaps could you share what those moments might be?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that we've mentioned Russia and Scotland, actually, because I think for a long time, Russia was a big driving force to everything else that I did, because this, the sting of that not working out was propelling me forward with determination for a lot of other stuff. And similarly, when I injured my leg in Scotland, when I went back to do it a second time, I was like, God, this is so amazing. This is all the stuff I didn't get to do. And I thought of how dejected and like mortified and upset and I was to be turning back in Scotland, and the pain of that, and like literally crying on the train home. And I thought of that person, like that Laura, past Laura, and I just thought, wow, she'd be so excited that she'd be back and her leg healed. And that kind of propelled me forwards for Scotland again. And also, I guess the more you do, the more you know that it passes. So you know that actually if you quit and you don't manage to finish something, I now know the pain of that very well. So that kind of stops me from quitting as well, because I think about it and I give myself the option and I think, well, actually, how's that going to feel? Like, let's sit in that decision. I quit and I turn home and I know it's going to feel absolutely awful. So that kind of helps. And to know that something brighter is going to happen, I think, is good to keep in perspective. And another thing I think that keeps that on track is a daily journal that I do. I should have mentioned this earlier. On every trip, I make a list of 3 things that have gone really well, that I feel really grateful for. And I know it sounds super cheesy, but that little habit has saved my bacon more time on adventures than I care to remember, because you'll have the worst day and you'll be, teetering on the edge of quitting and throwing the towel in and being like, this is stupid, I should just go home and be comfortable. And then you'll make yourself make a list of 3 things. You're like, oh, actually something good did happen today. And it just shifts your focus. And I think if you can shift your focus onto something good, that does an awful lot for your motivation.
You mentioned that you enjoy the preparation. You mentioned making lists there. Do you try and bring some structure into the adventures to help to try and add an element of routine?
Yeah,
to
massively. I'm a big fan of spreadsheets for adventures, which I know is not that cool, but I generally break down my days on an adventure or on a challenge to like daily mileage targets. And it's not that I can't experiment with that or, you know, maybe do a bit more, a bit less, depending on how I'm feeling. But for me, it really helps to have that target and something to aim for. So I put quite a lot of structure in. And I do that, like I said, for the target, but also because the last trip, for example, I needed to tell one of my brand partners when I'd be in the Netherlands, because I needed to hook up with them. So just actually, if I sit down and do that, it makes everything else a bit easier. So if an opportunity comes up when I'm on the road, I don't have to sit there for hours thinking about when I can fit something in. I can just look at the spreadsheet and be like, cool, we can talk on this day, or I can pop in to do a talk on this day. And that just saves an awful lot of headspace as well. Kind of just opening up and be like, right, this is the plan today. Is a big mental save of energy for me.
What are perhaps some of the smaller, quieter moments that you've had when you've been undertaking a challenge that just stand out to you as being sort of special memories that you reflect back upon?
I'm a sucker for a sunrise and a sunset, but especially sunrises. Because generally speaking, you tend to have the world to yourself at sunrise because people are sleeping. And I can think of so many peaceful mornings when I've set up early because I've got a longer mileage day ahead of me. And that's far away, that's in Russia, that's, you know, across Europe, but it's also on the Thames. Like I paddled the Thames home for Christmas one year in December, and my friend Pete and I would be on the river early morning, everyone's asleep, it's winter, and it's just so peaceful. And those magical moments, I think that's why I quite often go out for a sunrise ride or something when I'm home, because I'm trying to recapture that stillness and simplicity. So yeah, definitely sunrises.
Certainly feels like within the UK there is a thriving adventure community. How connected do you feel to that, and how much perhaps support and help is there within that community for fellow adventurers?
Yeah, I think the UK adventure community is absolutely amazing. I've certainly never experienced anything but a huge, huge, huge level of support. And I think everyone would say the same. And I would say that as well, now being a bit more experienced. If someone comes to me, I make sure that I take the time to reply to them. And I've got absolutely, you know, open door policy with people wanting advice or tips or anything, because I think it's important to pay it forward. And I think the reason it's so important to remember that is because everyone has to start somewhere. And so I certainly really appreciate all the advice that I got on very early on. And if anyone's listening to this, I just think it is really open. You know, everyone is really supportive. Everyone's really welcoming. And I think they want to help, you know, because everyone's had help along the way as well. And I think that in the UK, I think we are very lucky in that it is quite reciprocated.
And looking back now, what advice would you give to your younger jumping off the cliff in California yourself, having, you know, spent a number of years now as a professional adventurer? What would you go back and tell your younger self, if anything different at all?
Yeah, I guess the biggest thing for me is to care less about what you should be doing, because I think that's what drove me into that office job. And and I've never desired to work in insurance ever. Like that was never even anywhere on the dream list. And the only reason I did it is because I thought I should, you know, I thought I should be getting a mortgage. I thought I should have this money, and, you know, and that was just a complete disaster. But that pressure just led me down a really dodgy path. So I guess I'd try and care less about that stuff sooner. I mean, I wasn't there for very long, so I guess I did buck it quite early. But I think looking back and you get a bit older, you really realize that actually, you know, everyone's got their own stuff and it's okay to have a different path. But when you're a bit younger, it feels mortifying to look around you and think, well, actually, this is what everyone else is doing. And someone here is calling me irresponsible and telling me I should care about a mortgage. And that opinion seems really important to you at that point. And then later on, you realize that actually that's just someone's opinion.
And what is it now that you've got plenty of mileage under your belt, in whether it's kayaking or running or cycling? What is it now that excites you about future challenges and the next challenge? What is it that you look for and you perhaps need to have in the next adventure that you take on?
I think I've distilled this down, actually, because I think there's two kind of elements. But the biggest element for me, I've come to realize, is that my stomach has to feel a little bit sick. For me, it's really important to think, oh, have I got a bit too far? Like, am I going to be able to do this? Because if I know I can, I think, that just doesn't really do it. But it's this combination of like going somewhere new, and that's really exciting and that's really cool. And then it's like, but how can I push it? How can I really push like my body to the limit? And how can I figure out if that's, if it's possible? So that's normally characterized as well by like a week or two before, me thinking this is the worst idea I've ever had and I shouldn't have done it. So if I'm not feeling like that a week before the trip, I think something's probably gone a bit wrong.
And where's the favorite place that you've adventured and been to on your travels?
So Ireland is very dear to me because I'm half Irish, but also Norway. I think anyone who's ever been to Norway will agree with me. It's just magical. The people are incredible. The scenery is outrageous, and just the whole culture. There's such an outdoorsy kind of culture, and it just felt like they were on my wavelength. I really just felt really at home and really welcomed with the kindness. So yeah, Norway for sure.
And what's on the bucket list?
Oh goodness, what isn't on the bucket list? Definitely, I've not been to Canada. So Canada's pretty high. I'd like to maybe experiment a bit more with my running in the future. And I also want to switch up the cycling that I do. So I'd like to pack a bit lighter and go a bit quicker maybe. I feel like the distance with panniers is done now. But yeah, I think Canada is probably really high on the list for sure.
And if people want to buy a copy of the book, or find out more about your current and future challenges, where can they find you, Laura?
So the website is the best place to get the book. It's laurakairos.com, and my social media handles are the same. So Instagram and Facebook is Laura Kairos, and then on Twitter it's Kairos Laura.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for taking time out to have a chat today. Pleasure speaking with you. And good luck on the next challenge.
Thank you.